Hello and welcome to S&P Global Ratings Fixed Income in 15, a 15-minute chat with a market voice and an S&P executive. My name is Joe Cass. I head up market outreach in the UK, and today I'm joined by Ruchir Sharma, head of emerging markets and chief global strategist at Morgan Stanley Investment Management, and the global head of sovereign analytics and research at S&P Global Ratings, Roberto Sifon. Thanks very much for joining me today, Ruchir and Roberto.
Thank you for
Thank you.
Before we start, a reminder that the views of the external guests on the show today are their views alone, and they do not represent the views of S&P Global Ratings. So, Ruchir, let's kick off with some questions for you. What major trends are you seeing in the global fixed income market today?
I think that what we're seeing currently is quite historic, which is that we are at the possibly the reverse point of 1982. The 1982 was when we saw a big peak in interest rates around the world, led by Volcker's fight against inflation. That marked what now, in hindsight, obviously looks like a 40-year decline, virtually 30, 40-year decline in interest rates. I think that we are at a point now where central bankers and policymakers in general have converted to a very different view, which is that we'll do whatever it takes to push global GDP up, to push possibly inflation higher, and are willing to take the kind of risks which we would have thought would have been unthinkable a few years ago. So I think that this is the really big trend shift in fixed income markets, that this, at least on a cyclical basis, this massive decline in interest rates that we have seen over the last 30 to 40 years is now potentially drawing to a close. And a trough in both interest rates and inflation seems to be upon us.
And Ruchir, you've written a number of books in your career, the most recent of which is called The 10 Rules of Successful Nations. So can you tell us a little bit about the book and maybe how it could be relevant in a post-COVID world?
Right. So I think that the issue with economics and a lot of the books on economics is that they're written mainly from an academic standpoint. So you have all these, books that have been written over the years which speak about how the world is going to look like in the next 50 or 100 years, and it's based on this very long-term data, and sometimes it's not even practical. So I've always been very interested in macroeconomics, but not just in the subject, in terms of how to connect macroeconomics with the real world as an investor. So that's really what I've done with this book, The 10 Rules of Successful Nations, which is to try and put this together, that what are the 10 most important rules that you should look at to know if a nation is going to succeed or fail within a relevant time horizon. And by relevant time horizon, I really speak about 3 to 5 years, maximum up to a decade. I think anything beyond that, at least for 90% of the people, is irrelevant. It's just too long term, too hard to apply. So that's really what this book is about distilling what are the 10 most important things you should look at. For example, if you take a factor such as politics, I have an entire rule there, which is the fact that when is it that a nation carries out economic reforms which is good for economic growth? I really get into that. Is democracy or an authoritarian regime better for economic growth? It's answering those kind of questions, and also, about charting a timeline that when a new leader comes to office, until when is it good for the economy, and when does it really begin to get counterproductive for the economy? And the longer a leader stays in office, my analysis shows, the worse it is for that country. So I think that's really what it is about, trying to come up with these 10 practical rules that you can apply. And there are other factors such as education or something which may be relevant, but maybe over a 50, 100-year time frame in terms of moving the needle on a nation's growth prospects. So those are things that I've kept out, not because I don't understand the importance of it or I want to overlook it, but just feel it's not relevant from a practical time horizon. So this is really a practitioner's guide to how to look at the world and how to evaluate nations, rather than the kind of academic work that we often see in the field of economics.
So, Roberto, as our sovereign specialist, can you give us an overview of sovereign performance in 2020 and perhaps the outlook for EM sovereigns in 2021?
Great, thank you. Um, yeah, I guess in the context of what Ruchir was mentioning, right, the world we were, and this extremely low interest rate environment that we saw, coming to a really unprecedented level in 2020, and we're still there. 2020 was a very complicated years for governments, and particularly also for incumbent administration. We're already seeing what's happening for a few. If you think about it, just like every actor of the economy, governments have been suffering, uh, you know, on the revenue side, given the tremendous collapse on economic activity that the world went through. Um, Meanwhile, they will also have to take a big hit on the spending side, because they were also being the backstop of the global economy, and they have to provide an unprecedented support to economies all over the world. So you cannot take it from both sides. As a result, what we've seen was a massive accumulation of debt. But I always say, by the way, it didn't just start now. The accumulation of debt, if you look at the debt levels that you have pre-global financial crisis in 2008 and to 2019, meaning pre-COVID, were already pretty high, and showed a big accumulation of that. In came COVID, and you have an even greater accumulation of debt. I guess that's kind of tied up with what Ruchir was mentioning, what central bankers did. The way to respond to that was to basically make the cost of that financing low enough for governments to be able to withstand that. So in this context, the universe of sovereigns that we look at, what happened in 2020, we had about 25 downgrades globally. Who were those names? Majority there were in credits that were on the lower end of the scale, sovereigns that were most exposed, and also one important point that we always mention is there were a lot of sovereigns that were already struggling before COVID, struggling to find economic growth, struggling to move over structural reforms, etc. So when you're hit with a crisis like this, and you're already on a weak stage, definitely that doesn't bode well. And those were the sovereigns where you would see probably the most amount of negative actions. A lot of those are in emerging markets, just because, not because they're emerging market, but just because of the conditions that they were facing before COVID. As I said, of low growth or weak fiscal positions really make the fact that when they had to come in and face this crisis, their credit worthiness weakened. Going forward, what we see, we have about 25, also another 25 sovereigns with negative outlooks, which is, if you look at, we rate 135, so it's roughly lower than 30% of our portfolio in general. And they're going into 2021 with these negative outlooks. The portfolio is more mixed, so it's not just emerging market. There are few sovereigns in emerging market, but we also have some economies in the developed world or OECD economies where we see that cushion is eroding as we go into 2021. That is, I think, an important north to look at. How are all these economies going to perform? We think emerging markets, and we've already seen it, are receiving, partly because of this low interest rate environment, they're receiving a fair amount of flow of capital, which is supportive for them, because it will allow them to get at least that leg that they need to face recovery. And also, I think a lot of the adjustment was made already in 2020. So we think it's a little mixed depending on where you look at. We are more constructive in Asian emerging markets. I think the growth potential there, it's stronger than what you've seen, but you can see probably in Latin America or sub-Saharan Africa.
And Roberto, sustainable finance and ESG are becoming increasingly important in markets, of course. How do you factor in ESG when analysing the creditworthiness of a sovereign? Does one element of ESG have more weight than others?
Um, well, it, I always try to step back when I get this question because I think in the case of sovereign analysis is i- is one in which ESG have been at play for since we do sovereign ratings analysis. If you think about it, you know governance is at the center of our analysis. Social issues for governments, they're also at the center of what everything do. I think the one that has become a lot more prominent and it has gained more a larger space is definitely the environmental factor, right? In some parts of the world and in some sovereigns, this has been an issue forever, particularly those that were affected more or mostly affected by climate change or by natural disasters, etc. But I would say all three of those have been at the center of our analysis. What we're doing now is a much more is a work around increasing kind of dissecting those and maybe make it more evident on how each of these three really have an impact on and in which categories of our analysis they do. But definitely, I think if you look at governance, you would say probably in more than half of the sovereigns, governance is a strength. Of course, if you look at emerging markets, this is an area of opportunity for emerging markets where governance have been an issue and continues to be in many cases an issue and an area that needs to be improved.
Ruchir, you wrote a piece in the Financial Times about the impact of Bitcoin and its potential as a reserve currency. So, what's your current view on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency in general? How could it impact global markets and sovereigns in the future?
Right. So, if you what really intrigues me here is this, that if you look at the history of reserve currencies in the world, the average longevity of a currency in that pole position of being the reserve currency in the world is about 100 years. There have been about six reserve currencies over the last 600 years. Before the US dollar, it was the British pound. Before that, the French currency. And before that, the Dutch, the Spanish, and the Portuguese, so to speak. So the average duration was about 100 years. The US dollar is currently exactly there. In terms of for 100 years, it's been the world's reserve currency. And over the last few years, it has really appeared as if there is no alternative in the world to the US dollar. In fact, the dollar has never been this powerful on many metrics. 90% of all transactions in the world are conducted in the US dollar. 75% of external debt is issued in the US dollar. And nearly two-thirds of the world's foreign exchange reserves are denominated in the US dollar. And this is all even though the US share in global economic output now is about 25%, well off its highs. But as a financial superpower, because of the US dollar's strength and its ubiquity, the dollar has never been this dominant in the US, therefore, never been such a big financial superpower. But I think that this is the climax, this is the peak. And the pandemic may have played a very important role in that climax, because there's one data which really strikes me here, which is that last year the US printed uh, so much money that essentially 20% of all the dollars in circulation in the world were printed just last year. So it was a massive amount of monetary expansion that the US did. Now, the difference with the past was that when one country really began to spend and print this recklessly, there was some other currency waiting in the wing to take over from that currency, as we saw the dollar did from the British pound, and before that, the pound did from the French currency. The difference this time is that all central banks around the world are virtually following the same policies in terms of the amount of money they're printing, the way they're debasing their own currencies. And also the fact that the countries like China, which have emerged as an economic superpower have not been really able to emerge as a financial superpower because of the capital account restrictions that China has, its unique position there. And the euro, because of all the problems which seem to keep cropping up in Euroland with the politics and other issues, the euro has never really lived up to its promise either. So that's the big gap out here, which is that the dollars had an incredible run. 100 years as the world's reserve currency, which is about the average duration that a country tends to have a reserve currency for. And there is no real alternative to the US dollar just now because of the fact that you have all these other countries which are following either similar policies or have their own local idiosyncrasies. So I think in here really comes Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and blockchain technology and all that, because the world and nature abhor a vacuum. That in this vacuum, something had to emerge. And I think that the rise of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is really that. If nothing else, it's a warning shot that if you take your reserve currency status for granted and you print this way, something is going to emerge. There's going to be some reaction somewhere. So, therefore, I've been relatively optimistic on the prospects for Bitcoin and cryptocurrency over the past year or so. Now, of course, when something goes up 5 times over a short span of time, I mean, like you pause, you think about what's going on, and it may well be that Bitcoin is not the final answer. It is regulated away, or this is just another sign of too much speculative froth in the markets. But I think that it is a very important sign and a shot across the bow that the dollar's unquestioned reign cannot be taken for granted and may be coming to an end. So I think it's in that context that I see the rise of Bitcoins, and it is taking over as the new gold. The size of the Bitcoin market is about maybe like $1 trillion, but the size of the gold market is $12 trillion. And there's a very important demographic shift out here that the younger generation wants to believe that Bitcoin is the new gold, some sort of store of value because its supply is finite. The older generation is still very distrustful of Bitcoin, and the data in surveys shows that they still sort of prefer gold and can't sort of come to grips with what's this Bitcoin phenomenon. So I think that that's really what's going on out here. That something had to come in to step in here when things were being taken for granted, and that's how I explain Bitcoin's phenomenal increase over the last year.
Great, thanks, Ruchir. So now quickly to finish off, we'll have some non-market related questions. So Roberto, I'll kick off with you. You're Argentinian. So by proxy, that means you are a fan of football or soccer to our American friends. So next year is the World Cup, 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Over here in England, as always, we have high hopes of progressing. But what do you think of Argentina's chances? And what role will Lionel Messi play?
Do I have to give you an analytical answer or or a fun answer? If I give you a fun answer, I had to say, yeah, I hope that this is it. But analytically, I don't know. I mean, we've had amazing teams, and it's just it seems to be, it always seems to slip away at the end. So I had to keep my candle on and hoping that this is the time that we'll get it again, but we'll see.
Great. So, Ruchir, before the pandemic hit, I understand that you were a keen traveller, particularly to emerging market countries, sometimes spending 1 week a month on the road. So in the current climate, obviously, travel's not possible. So how did these trips inform your view, and what do you miss most about traveling the world?
Well, I think that luckily, one thing which I've done is come up with this framework of the 10 rules, right, for successful nations. And what those 10 rules really do is to systematize the process. Because in the past, when we'd have to travel to the countries to try and look for the right information, come up with our own assessment. But at least coming up with these 10 rules systematizes that you can talk to the locals there, and you can come up with what how to score the nations based on what you think is relevant. So in that way, I'm happy that I've got this process underway. But needless to say that the best way to focus one's attention is to be in that country, because when you're in that country, you're picking up so many nuances, you're picking up so much information. And even if it's all there in a research report, your mind is much more focused when you're actually in that country, because that's all you're living and breathing in a way. So I miss that. And I hope that I can return to doing that in the not too distant future. But the good thing is that when you have a framework such as this, at least you've systematized it, and you can keep applying it and keep assessing countries based on a framework such as that.
So, Roberto, what hobby have you had a chance to spend more time on during the past year?
Well, as you mentioned, I'm from Argentina, so but just like with soccer, the next thing we like to do is to do asados, which is barbecue. And that's pretty much what I've done. I mean, I've tried to master that, and look at a lot of different things in YouTube and so on to see try to find new recipes. So I really pick up on cooking, and of course now it's winter here in the northern hemisphere, so I try to do that indoors and try to find new ways to do that fun stuff
Fantastic.
for the weekends.
Ruchir, I've heard that you are a great sprinter, representing India in the World Masters Athletic Championship. How has the sprint training been going over lockdown?
I have to say pretty well, because, but for whatever reason, I think that this is the best shape I've been in, because I've been even more focused on it. I've had more time for it and more discipline. And I think we are eating better and focusing a bit more on that, I think. So, in that way, I think that this has been like a silver lining of the pandemic. There are lots of things we obviously don't like about it, but this has been a silver lining of it. So, yeah, I think that's going well. I was all set to participate in the World Masters Championship last year in Toronto. It was scheduled for August of 2020. So that obviously got canned. But I'm looking forward to the next such championship, and hopefully I can maintain this level of training.
And Ruchir, the last question of this session goes to you. So, on Fixed Income in 15, I usually interview leaders, influential individuals from the world of finance. From your experience, who would make a fantastic next guest for me on this show?
Well, that's a tough one because I think that you got a very good choice. But when I look at some of the best macro thinkers in the world, and that breed is sort of dying, I feel a bit. But like, who are the people that I would stop and listen to if they had something to say at any point in time? I would be, put like someone like a Stan Druckenmiller up there. That I would like stop and listen to what he has to say, because very few people I think understand macro investing like he does. He's like I think he's the king of the jungle as far as that's concerned. So if you're asking for one name, that's possibly it.
I have to get in touch with him, see what he says. Well, great. My thanks to you, Ruchir and Roberto, for your time today. And thanks to everyone for watching. See you next time on Fixed Income in 15.